Rain fell in narrow silver lines across Mulberry Street, soaking the cobblestones until they gleamed like spilled ink beneath the flickering lamps. The city had long since quieted for the night, yet in the alleys and narrow doorways of lower Manhattan, there lingered the hollow pulse of something unslept, a restless hum woven into the very bones of the place. Thomas Whitfield, collar turned high against the storm, walked quickly, his shoes slapping against the pavement. He should not have been out at that hour. His shift at the printing press had ended hours before, and there was nothing waiting for him but his dim little apartment with its leaky radiator and single brass lamp. Yet something had pulled him deeper into the wet streets, some faint suggestion of sound threading its way through the noise of rain. It was music. At first he thought it a trick of memory, some half-remembered barroom tune rising up from the storm. But the closer he drew to the intersection, the clearer it became, a woman's voice, thin and lilting, gliding above the hiss of rain. No instrument, no accompaniment, just a voice carried on the storm, leading him like a lantern swinging in the dark. He turned down an alley he had never noticed before. Narrow, crooked, the walls leaning inward like suspicious old men. And there, half hidden between a shuttered bakery and a pawnshop that looked long abandoned, a sign swayed weakly in the wind. The paint had peeled to near nothing, but the letters could still be read in the lamplight. Hollowford Records. The shop windows were filmed with grime, the glass cracked, and yet, the faint glow of a lamp burned within. Thomas should have turned back. Every instinct in him whispered that no shop in that part of the city had any business being open past midnight in a storm. Yet the song pulled him forward. His hand found the door before he had even decided, and with a reluctant groan of hinges, it opened. The smell struck him first, dust, wet wood, and the dry, chemical tang of shellac. Rows of shelves leaned beneath the weight of records in brittle sleeves, their spines mottled with mold and age. A phonograph stood at the center of the shop, its brass horn like a flower frozen mid-bloom, though the turntable spun silently, no record on its surface. And then the voice. Clearer now, impossibly near. A woman's voice rising from nowhere, threading through the air with unnatural clarity, as if the walls themselves were singing. Thomas froze, every hair along his arms stiff with cold. The words were foreign, but the cadence was unmistakable, a song, older than the city itself, dripping with longing and sorrow. He stepped closer, his breath fogging in the lamp's glow. There, upon the counter, half buried beneath a stack of forgotten records, lay a single disc. Its surface was scratched, the label faded, but he could make out 3 words scrawled in hurried ink. The girl in the phonograph. And as his trembling fingers reached for it, the song ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, more terrible than the voice itself. Only the rain outside remained, tapping at the windows like impatient fingers. Thomas turned toward the door, the record clutched in his hand. He could not have said why, but in that instant he knew, whatever had been singing, it was waiting for him to play it. And once played, it would not stop. Thomas carried the record home like a thief cradling stolen treasure. The sleeve was damp from the rain, its edges curling, but he clutched it beneath his coat, shielding it as though it were something fragile, alive. The storm had not relented. Water coursed down the gutters in black rivulets, and every step sent a splash of cold against his ankles. He moved quickly through the streets, head bent, ignoring the curious glances of the few night walkers still wandering. To them, he must have looked like any other weary working man, staggering home from some shift too long. Yet the truth was stranger. He carried with him something that felt less like an object, and more like a secret. When he reached his building, a crooked, soot-stained tenement on the edge of Bowery, he climbed the stairs 2 at a time. His boots squeaked with water, his breath fogging in the chill air. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and kerosene, a sour perfume that clung to the walls no matter the season. He let himself into his apartment, locking the door behind him with a care he had never bothered with before. The room was as he had left it, small, plain, furnished only by necessity. A narrow iron bed, a table scarred by years of use, a chair with one uneven leg. The radiator hissed and clanked in the corner, giving off more noise than warmth. But it was the phonograph, squatting on its wooden stand by the far wall, that seemed to watch him as he entered. The brass horn caught the lamplight, gleaming dully, as if waiting. Thomas set the record down on the table and stared at it. At first glance, it was nothing unusual. A black disc, standard size, edges chipped, grooves worn with age. But the label, or what remained of it, bore no manufacturer's mark, no title beyond those scrawled words in ink. The girl in the phonograph. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, as though the writer had not intended for it to last. Yet the ink had not faded with time. It seemed almost fresh, wet to the touch, though Thomas's fingers came away clean. He should have thrown it out. Every instinct told him so. A strange record found in a shop that should not exist, carrying a song that should not be heard. It was madness to keep it. But he did not throw it out. Instead, he lit the lamp, set the chair by the table, and sat with the record in his lap. For a long while he did not move, only traced the grooves with his eyes, letting the storm outside fill the silence. Finally, with a deep breath, he rose. He placed the disc on the turntable. His fingers trembled as he wound the crank, the old brass key groaning in protest. The phonograph came alive with a low mechanical hum. The turntable began to spin, slowly at first, then steady, hypnotic. Thomas lifted the tone arm. He hesitated. Somewhere deep in his chest, he felt the same tightness one feels before stepping into a darkened room, the irrational fear that something waits just beyond sight. He lowered the needle. The hiss began, the soft crackle of static, like distant rain. Then came the voice. It was the same voice he had heard in the shop. A woman's voice, clear, intimate, impossibly close. She sang in a language he did not know, syllables fluid and strange, yet threaded with emotion so raw that it bypassed understanding. The melody rose and fell in long, mournful arcs, each note lingering as though reluctant to leave. Thomas sat frozen, his breath caught. He had heard singers before, in the clubs, in the vaudeville theaters, but nothing like this. It was as though the voice reached into him, bypassing the ear, vibrating directly against the bone. The room seemed to shrink around him. The hiss of the radiator dimmed. The storm outside faded. There was only the song. And then he realized, she was not singing to no one. She was singing to him. The words shifted, became sharper, clearer, as though translating themselves as they left the grooves. He began to understand. Fragments at first, then phrases. You are alone. You listen still. You brought me here. His hands gripped the arms of the chair until his knuckles blanched. He leaned forward, eyes wide, watching the record spin as though it might reveal some trick. But there was no trick. Only the voice, and the growing certainty that whoever sang knew him. When the song ended, silence returned with a weight that pressed against his chest. Thomas lifted the needle with shaking hands. He should have destroyed the record then. Snapped it in half, thrown the pieces into the alley, let the rain wash them into the gutter. But he didn't. He slid it back into its sleeve, placed it on the table, and stared at it as if it might move on its own. Hours passed. The lamp guttered. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the melody still threading through his mind. And just before sleep claimed him, he thought he heard it again. Faint. Whispering. From the phonograph. Thomas awoke with a start. The lamp had burned low, its light a feeble amber against the peeling wallpaper. His mouth was dry, his limbs heavy, but it was not the exhaustion of a long day's labor that gripped him. No, it was the lingering echo of the song, still present in his ears though the phonograph sat silent. He sat up in bed. The air was colder than it had been when he fell asleep. Damp, as though the rain outside had seeped through the very walls. His eyes drifted toward the table. The record lay there in its sleeve, inert. Yet the certainty pressed against his mind, it was not finished with him. Thomas rose. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, protesting. He padded barefoot to the table and reached for the record, meaning only to reassure himself that it was truly there, just an object, nothing more. But the moment his fingers brushed the sleeve, a pulse of static shivered up his arm, faint, like the brush of cobwebs, yet undeniable. He snatched his hand back, heart pounding. His rational mind rebelled. He was tired, he was dreaming, he had imagined it. But even as he thought it, a sound rose from the phonograph, the faintest crackle, as though the needle had lowered itself upon the disc. The turntable was still. The tone arm untouched. Yet the sound was there. A breath. A whisper. A single note of the melody, almost too faint to hear. Thomas staggered back, his heel striking the leg of the bed. He told himself it was impossible, that machines did not operate without hands. Yet as he stood frozen, the whispering voice threaded through the silence again. This time there were words, unmistakable, curling into his ear though no lips had spoken them. "Play me again." He did not sleep the rest of that night. When dawn came, the light was gray and heavy, the storm having left the streets glistening and foul with mud. Thomas dressed mechanically, his hands clumsy with fatigue. The record remained on the table, patient, expectant. At the press room, he worked his shift in silence. The others joked and cursed as usual, their voices echoing against the tin roof, but Thomas barely heard them. Each thud of the printing press was another note of the song. Each hiss of steam another whisper. By midday he could bear it no longer. He begged an early release, muttering about illness. His foreman, a hulking man with little sympathy, waved him off with irritation. Thomas left into the smog-choked afternoon, the city streets pulsing around him like veins. And yet, he realized, he was not walking home. His steps had turned elsewhere. Back toward Mulberry Street. The shop should not have been there. He knew this, because he had searched the maps in his office and questioned men who had walked those streets their whole lives. Yet when he rounded the alley, there it was again, Hollowford Records, its crooked sign swaying above the door. But now the windows were dark. The lamp was gone. The shelves visible only as shadows through the grime-streaked glass. Thomas pressed a hand against the door. Locked. He rattled it once, twice, but the hinges did not budge. Inside, silence. A flicker of doubt pierced him. Had it been a dream after all? A trick of fatigue and storm? Perhaps he had wandered into some long-abandoned shop, taken a relic best left to rot. And then, from the depths of the store, he heard it. The voice. Soft, muffled, yet undeniably there. "You came back." Thomas stumbled from the door, heart hammering. He fled the alley, did not stop until the sounds of the city swallowed him again. Yet all through the streets, the voice followed, carried on the wind, bleeding from the whistle of the trams and the cries of the hawkers. By the time he reached his apartment, his mind was frayed. His hands shook as he unlocked the door. He told himself he would destroy the record now, once and for all. He crossed the room, seized it from the table, and froze. The sleeve was gone. The disc lay bare. And etched into its black surface, along the rim where no grooves had been before, were new words. "You listened once. You will listen again." Thomas stared at the etched words until his eyes blurred. They had not been there before. He was certain. The grooves of a record did not change, did not write themselves anew like some diary written in the dark. And yet there they were, faint but deliberate, letters carved so shallowly they shimmered when the lamplight caught them. He dropped the record onto the table as though it had burned him. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. The radiator hissed in the corner, the storm beyond the glass rattled weakly, and still he felt it, that waiting, suffocating presence, as though the room itself leaned in to hear what he would do next. His rational mind screamed for him to end it. To smash the record into shards and scatter it to the gutters where no man would find it. His hand even twitched toward the phonograph stand, toward the heavy brass tone-arm that could serve as a hammer. But something stronger moved in him. Not curiosity, no, this was deeper, a compulsion, a need as gnawing as hunger. The voice had called to him, had found him, and now it demanded to be heard again. Thomas's breath shuddered out of him. He lifted the record with trembling fingers, set it upon the turntable. The grooves glistened faintly, as though slick with unseen moisture. He wound the crank. The mechanism ticked, groaned, and then the disc began to spin. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then the static crackled to life. And the voice returned. It was not the same song as before. The melody was sharper now, jagged, the words striking like knives rather than sighing like laments. The language shifted between syllables he did not know and phrases he understood too well. "You belong to me." Every listener does. Thomas gripped the edge of the table until splinters pressed into his palms. His mind screamed to stop the needle, to tear the disc free, but his body betrayed him. He sat frozen, as though the chair itself had grown roots. The air grew colder. His breath misted in the dim lamplight. Shadows lengthened along the walls, distorting, bending. For an instant he thought he saw a shape in the brass horn itself, the faint impression of a face, delicate and pale, lips parted in endless song. His heart thundered. He could not move. The voice rose, filling the room, filling him. And as the final note spiraled into silence, it spoke clearly, without melody, without disguise. This is only the beginning. The needle scraped against the end groove. The phonograph stilled. And Thomas, drenched in sweat though the room was icy, knew with sick certainty that the record would never stop calling for him. The next morning broke gray and bitter. The storm had passed, but the city seemed not refreshed but drowned. Every street glistened with oily puddles, every alley smelled of rot. Thomas rose late, his head heavy, his stomach hollow, as though he had not eaten in days. Sleep had given him no rest. It had only been a procession of dreams where voices hummed in his ear, low and insistent, like bees caught beneath his skin. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the phonograph. The record still rested there, its black surface catching faint threads of light. He half expected to see the grooves moving on their own, writhing like worms. He told himself he would not touch it again. He had work to do, a life to live, no time to indulge in madness. Yet as he dressed, as he splashed cold water on his face, as he forced down a crust of bread, the thought pressed against him, what if I imagined it? What if the voice had only been exhaustion, the storm, my mind playing tricks? He carried the thought with him out into the streets, down the rattling trams, through the pressroom where the machines pounded out their endless rhythm. Yet the rhythm betrayed him, each strike of the press became a drumbeat, each hiss of steam a breath, each rattle of gears a whisper. The noise of the shop folded into a cadence, a song that only he could hear. You will return. You cannot resist. Thomas slammed his fists against the printing table, startling the men around him. They cursed, laughed, asked what devil had ridden him. He muttered excuses, lack of sleep, a sour stomach, and returned to his work. But inside, his nerves crackled like wires about to snap. By the end of his shift, he could not bear it. He hurried home through the evening smog, his boots slapping against the pavement, his hands shaking as though he were ill. The apartment door closed behind him with a hollow thud. He leaned against it, chest heaving, eyes locked on the phonograph. And there it was again, faint, rising from the air like smoke. Not a song this time, but a hum. A presence. Thomas crossed the room in a daze. He lowered himself into the chair, his hands trembling as he reached for the record. No, he whispered to himself. Not again. Not again. But even as he said it, he was lifting the disc, setting it on the turntable. His fingers moved without his consent. He wound the crank. The turntable spun. The needle fell. Static. Then the voice. This time, she did not sing. She spoke. The sound was impossible, more intimate than thought, closer than breath. It filled his ears, his mind, as if the grooves of the record had carved themselves into his skull. Thomas Whitfield. His heart seized. She knew his name. Printer. Alone. Longing. Empty. His throat closed. His hands clutched the arms of the chair. I see you. I hear you. You hear me. He tried to shout, to deny it, but no words came. Only a strangled gasp, lost beneath her voice. You belong to me now. You brought me into your world. You cannot shut me out. The air grew heavy, thick, as though the walls themselves pressed inward. The lamp flickered, shadows stretching long and thin across the wallpaper. The radiator hissed a warning, pipes clanking like distant bells. Thomas tried to lift the needle. His arm refused to obey. The voice wound around his limbs, heavy as chains, sweet as lullabies. I was forgotten. Buried. Silent. But you woke me. You set me free. The words pulsed inside his skull. His vision blurred, swimming. For a moment he thought he saw her again, not in the horn this time, but in the corner of the room. A pale outline, faint as mist, hair dark, face turned toward him though her features refused to form. He shut his eyes. Tears slipped hot down his cheeks. I will sing again, she whispered. And you will listen. Always. The record hissed. The voice fell silent. And Thomas, gasping, finally found himself free to move. The hours after the record ended stretched long and brittle. Thomas paced his apartment like a prisoner, his boots clicking against the floorboards, his eyes never straying far from the phonograph. It sat there in the dim lamplight, silent, innocent, as though it were no more than wood and brass and shellac. Yet the memory of her voice lingered in every corner, woven into the fabric of the room. When midnight came, he doused the lamp and lay on his narrow bed. He pulled the blanket tight around his shoulders, shut his eyes, and prayed for sleep. But the silence was not empty. At first it was only the faint hum of the radiator, the tick of the pipes. Then came a thread of sound, delicate, careful, winding through the dark like smoke. A single note, sustained. Then another. He sat up, heart hammering. The phonograph was dark, still. The record sat untouched. Yet the song filled the air. It was softer than before, more intimate, as though sung directly into his ear. The words slipped around him, stroking, coaxing, suffocating. You cannot turn away. Thomas clapped his hands over his ears. The sound did not dim. It swelled inside his skull, vibrating through his bones. He stumbled from the bed, collided with the wall, sank to the floor. I am with you. Always. Awake, asleep, it does not matter. You are mine. He whimpered, a pitiful sound, stripped of dignity. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the voice vanished, leaving only the rush of his ragged breath. The next morning, he looked a wreck. His reflection in the cracked mirror showed a face pale as parchment, eyes shadowed, lips cracked. He shaved with trembling hands, cutting himself twice, the blood dripping into the chipped porcelain sink. At the press room, the others noticed. Christ, Whitfield, one man muttered, wrinkling his nose. You look like you've been sleeping in the morgue. Thomas tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. Long night. The foreman barked orders. The men bent to their machines. But more than once, Thomas caught them staring at him from the corners of their eyes, whispering when they thought he could not hear. He could not tell them. They would call him mad. Perhaps he was. All day the presses thundered, and all day he heard her voice woven into their rhythm. That evening, he returned home with a resolve he barely believed himself capable of. He would not touch the record again. He would not give her voice another chance to seep into him. He would wrap it in cloth, bury it beneath the floorboards, throw it into the river if he must. He lit the lamp. The apartment smelled faintly of mildew, of cold metal. The phonograph stood as always, gleaming in the corner. The record lay beside it on the table. But something was wrong. The sleeve was gone again. And the record, it was not where he had left it. It sat on the turntable. Perfectly centered. The crank wound, the needle resting just above the grooves, as if waiting for the faintest touch to spring to life. Thomas froze in the doorway, the key still clutched in his hand. He had not touched it. He knew he had not touched it. And yet the machine waited, silent, eager. His breath came fast, ragged. His knees weakened. The shadows stretched long across the walls, bending toward the phonograph as if the whole room leaned into its waiting hunger. And then, before he could move, before he could even drop the key from his hand, the tone arm lowered itself. The needle kissed the groove. Static. And the voice sang again. Welcome back. The days bled together after that night. Thomas no longer trusted time. Each morning he woke drenched in sweat, the melody still humming in his chest, and each evening he returned to his apartment with the certainty that she would be waiting. At first, he told himself he would not listen. He promised himself he would leave the record untouched, locked away, ignored. Yet every night the same pattern unfolded. He would light the lamp, settle into his chair, and find the disc already placed on the turntable, the crank wound, the needle hovering above the grooves like a poised blade. And always, always, it would play. He tried leaving the phonograph unplugged, but the machine spun as though wound by invisible hands. He hid the record in the cupboard beneath his sink, but come dusk it reappeared on the turntable, waiting. He even carried it to the pressroom once, meaning to slip it into the furnace where scrap paper burned, but the foreman caught him and barked questions. Thomas stammered excuses, clutched the sleeve tight to his chest, and fled home. That night, it spun again. But the songs were changing. At first they had been strange, mournful laments sung in a tongue he could not place. Then came the whispers, the personal words, the phrases in English that cut straight through his skull. Now, the melodies twisted further still. The voice sang his memories. It began innocently, a childhood lullaby his mother had hummed when he was sick. He had not thought of it in 20 years, yet the record crooned it with flawless clarity, in a voice that was not his mother's but knew her intonation all the same. The next night, it sang the hymn played at his father's funeral. The low drone of the church organ, the trembling notes of the choir, all captured in the grooves of the record though no such recording could exist. By the third night, it was worse. It sang words he had never spoken aloud. Dark thoughts. Shameful confessions. The jealousies he had hidden, the cruelties he had committed in secret. It sang his soul bare, peeling back the skin of his mind and laying the marrow to the air. And through it all, her voice remained beautiful. Terrible. Irresistible. The city began to change around him. In the clatter of hooves against cobblestones, he heard the faint trace of the melody. In the chatter of office boys, the laughter of women, the calls of street vendors, her voice threaded like a silver needle, stitching every sound into her endless song. At the press room, the thunder of the machines fell into rhythm with the record's hiss. At night, the pipes of his building clanged in harmony with her notes. Even the rain seemed to fall in time with her cadences, each drop a beat in her infernal music. Thomas grew thinner. His cheeks hollowed. His eyes sank deep into shadow. The men at the press stopped joking with him, they muttered instead, crossed themselves when they thought he wasn't looking. He caught his reflection once in the tram's glass window, he barely recognized the gaunt, fevered man staring back. But none of it mattered. Only the song mattered. One evening, as the record spun its shifting melody, Thomas realized the words were no longer addressing him alone. They were naming others. Samuel Rourke. Eleanor Whitfield. Daniel Haldane. The names spilled into the air, each one heavy, deliberate. Some meant nothing to him. But one, Eleanor Whitfield, pricked at his memory. He had seen that name before. Where? He racked his mind, and then it came, a headline from years past. Local woman vanishes, last seen near Ashfield fog. He remembered the whispers in the pub, the speculation of foul play, of madness, of disappearance. And Samuel Rourke, yes, that too. A name spoken once by an old man in the tenement, muttered with fear. A story of a traveler who had walked into the mist one night and never returned. The record sang their names as though they were verses in a hymn. They listened. They belonged to me. Thomas clutched his head, shaking violently. No, he shouted, his voice ragged. I don't belong to you. I'm not like them. But the voice only laughed, soft, lilting, sweet as poisoned honey. You already do. The lamp sputtered. Shadows lengthened across the walls. Thomas's stomach turned with sudden nausea. He staggered to the window, threw it open, gasped for air. The street below was dark, the gas lamps blurred by mist. For a moment he thought he saw shapes moving within the fog, pale figures, faces turned upward toward him, mouths opening in unison as though to sing. He slammed the window shut. When he turned back, the phonograph horn was not empty. A face had formed within its brass curves. Pale. Hollow-eyed. Lips parted in a smile that was not a smile at all. Her face. And it was no longer only a voice. The record ended, but the face remained. Thomas stood frozen, every muscle locked in place, his gaze fixed on the brass horn. It was impossible, the horn was polished metal, an empty mouth meant only to amplify sound. And yet the contours of a face shimmered there, faint at first, then sharper with each flicker of the lamp. The eyes were hollow pools of shadow. The lips curved, stretching wider than they should, as if they had forgotten the limit of flesh. She did not move, not quite, but there was the sense of movement, like an image seen through water. Then her mouth opened. The hiss of the record had stopped minutes ago, yet her voice issued from the horn, rich and clear, threading into the air as if it had never left. I see you. Thomas stumbled back, the chair toppling behind him. His knees struck the floor. He crawled toward the door, clawing at the knob with desperate hands. But the metal burned beneath his grip, hot as a stove, and he cried out in pain. The shadows of the room lengthened, deepened. The face in the horn leaned forward, or seemed to, though the brass did not bend. For a heartbeat, he thought it would emerge fully into his room, peel itself free of the phonograph like skin from bone. And then, silence. The lamp flickered once and went out. The room was swallowed whole by darkness. When dawn came, Thomas found himself on the floor, curled in a corner. The phonograph sat as it always had, silent, still, its horn catching the faint morning light. No face remained. No voice lingered. And yet he could not shake the certainty that she was watching him. The visions did not stop. At first they came only in the lamplight, when shadows gathered long against the walls. Then they began to seep into his waking hours. He would glimpse her reflection in the tram's windows, a pale silhouette seated beside him, lips curved in that terrible knot smile. When he turned, the seat was empty. In the press room, as the machines thundered, he saw her face hovering in the steam, forming and unforming with each hiss of the pipes. Once, when he leaned too close, he thought he felt her breath against his cheek, cool, damp, carrying the scent of rain-soaked stone. At night, the visions grew sharper. He no longer dared look directly at the phonograph. Instead he kept the lamp dim, the record sealed beneath a cloth, and tried to ignore the itch at the back of his skull. But his eyes betrayed him. They would drift to the corner, to the curve of brass, to the faint impression of features that never quite faded. She was patient. She was waiting. One evening, as he stumbled home through the fog-heavy streets, Thomas realized he was not alone. The city was unusually still. The lamps flickered, their halos swallowed by the mist. He walked quickly, collar pulled high, his boots clapping against the wet stones. Then he heard it, the faint echo of footsteps behind him. He turned. No one. He walked faster. The echo matched him, each step in perfect rhythm. He broke into a near run, his chest heaving, his throat raw with the damp air. He dared one glance back. And froze. Through the mist, a figure stood at the mouth of the alley. Too far to see clearly, yet unmistakable in its stillness. A woman, slender, unmoving, her face pale against the gloom. She did not follow. She only watched. Thomas fled. He did not stop until he slammed his apartment door shut and bolted it, his breath rattling in his chest. But even as he leaned against the wood, his body trembling, he knew the truth. He had not escaped. Because when he turned, the record was already spinning. The song followed him now, not just in the solitude of his apartment but in the open streets, in the noise of the living city. It began with faint hums, threads of melody hidden in the rattle of tram wheels or the calls of newspaper boys. He would be crossing Bowery, shoulders hunched against the cold, and the hiss of steam from a manhole would carry the sound of her voice. Soft. Patient. Crooning his name. At first he told himself it was madness. A mind frayed by sleepless nights, nothing more. But soon others began to notice. In the press room, as the machines roared, a boy named Jacob leaned toward him. "Whitfield," he muttered, eyes wide, "do you hear it?" Thomas stiffened. "Hear what?" "That song. Like someone's humming, just there under the noise." Jacob pointed toward the pipes that clanged above their heads. "Sounds like a woman. You hear it, don't you?" Thomas's blood went cold. He shook his head violently. "No. You're imagining things." But Jacob's expression told him the boy was not convinced. The song grew bolder. On the tram, passengers began to shift uncomfortably, glancing around as though someone were singing just beyond hearing. A mother pulled her child close, muttering that she didn't like that strange tune. A drunk muttered prayers under his breath, swaying with the rhythm that only some could hear. And Thomas, caught in the center, felt the weight of her triumph. She was no longer content to haunt him alone. She was spreading. At night, his apartment became unbearable. He barred the windows, shoved a chair against the door, covered the phonograph with a blanket. Yet the song seeped through, relentless. It curled beneath the doorframe, hummed in the radiator pipes, trembled through the floorboards as if the entire building had become a hollow instrument for her voice. One night, desperate, he stuffed rags into his ears and lay shivering beneath the blanket. For a moment, blessed silence. Then, vibration. The sound sang not to his ears but inside his skull, pulsing against bone. "You cannot hide. You cannot silence me." He screamed, tore the rags free, and wept into his hands. Others began to look at him differently. The neighbors in his tenement whispered when he passed. An old woman crossed herself and muttered about curses. At the corner pub, where he sometimes tried to drown himself in whiskey, men stared and shifted their chairs away, as though some invisible odor clung to him. He heard scraps of talk, always muttering to himself. Pale as a corpse. Brings something with him, a chill. And always, beneath their voices, beneath the rumble of the city, her song persisted. One evening, as he staggered home through the fog, he passed a group of children skipping rope in the street. Their chant rose high and bright. 3, 4, shut the door. Then, without faltering, without pause, their voices shifted. A melody slid into their rhyme, a tune that froze Thomas in place. It was her song. The children's lips moved in perfect unison, eyes blank, faces slack as they sang her melody. The rope slapped the stones in flawless rhythm. Thomas stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. When he blinked, the children were laughing again, their rhyme restored, the strange tune gone. But he could not unhear it. She was teaching others to sing. That night, he sat before the phonograph, hollow-eyed, hands trembling. The record spun though he had not touched it. Her voice poured into the room, rich and intoxicating. You see now. You understand. My song does not end with you. Thomas shook his head weakly. What do you want from me? The horn gleamed. Her voice coiled like smoke. I want what I have always wanted. Ears to hear. Hearts to claim. And through you, Thomas Whitfield, I will have them. The shadows on the walls stretched, bent, writhed like dancers in some grotesque waltz. The air thrummed with the pulse of her melody, every surface vibrating. And Thomas, weeping, understood the truth. He had not found the record. The record had found him. The city was changing. At first it was subtle, a hum beneath the noise, a tune hidden in the clatter of wheels and the hiss of steam. But soon it became undeniable. Everywhere Thomas went, he heard her. In the groan of the tramlines, her voice. In the creak of the ship masts at the docks, her lullaby. In the whine of wind through alleyways, her endless refrain. The city itself had become her instrument, and he her unwilling conductor. One evening, as he trudged along Mulberry Street, he saw a ragged beggar slumped in a doorway, rocking back and forth. At first Thomas thought the man drunk. Then he heard it, the beggar was humming. The same tune. Eyes glazed, lips trembling, the men crooned the melody Thomas knew too well. When Thomas drew nearer, the beggar's head jerked up. Their eyes locked. For a heartbeat the world narrowed, the street, the fog, the lamps all faded. There was only the beggar's voice, and within it, hers. He belongs to me, the beggar whispered, though his lips hardly moved. And so will you. Thomas staggered back, horror flooding him. The beggar laughed, a dry, broken sound, then bent again, humming, lost to the world. It did not stop there. At the press room, Jacob, the boy who had once confessed to hearing the song, grew pale and distracted. He worked with a strange, mechanical precision, his eyes unfocused, lips moving silently. When Thomas asked if he was well, Jacob looked at him blankly, then smiled with a terrible calm. I can hear her more clearly now, Jacob murmured. She says the song is almost ready. Thomas's blood ran cold. Stop. Don't listen. For God's sake, don't listen. But Jacob only turned back to the machine, humming softly beneath his breath. The infection spread like fog. A woman in the market suddenly dropped her basket and began to sing in a voice not her own. Her children screamed as strangers pulled her away, yet the tune carried, unbroken, until she collapsed in silence. An old man on the tram began tapping his cane against the floor in perfect rhythm to a melody no one else recognized, until others began to tap along, one by one, their eyes distant. At night, choruses of voices drifted up from the streets below Thomas's apartment. Not organized, not rehearsed, yet bound together by the same dreadful rhythm. A choir of the damned, unknowing, unwilling, and yet caught. Thomas barricaded himself in his room. He stuffed cloth beneath the door, nailed the shutters closed, tried to drown out the voices with blankets over his ears. Nothing helped. The phonograph always played. Sometimes it began in the dead of night. Sometimes it started before he even returned home, the sound seeping through the cracks of the door as he climbed the stairs. And worse, the face in the horn grew clearer. The misty outline sharpened, features forming like paint on a canvas. Pale cheeks. dark hair falling loose, eyes like voids. Each night she leaned closer, closer, until Thomas could swear her breath chilled his skin. "You are mine," she whispered. "But I will not stop with you. The city is singing, Thomas. Soon, the world will sing." One night, unable to bear it, he fled his room and ran through the streets. Fog pressed heavy against the gas lamps, muffling light, swallowing sound. Yet within it the melody threaded, faint but everywhere, rising from 1,000 unseen throats. He turned corner after corner, seeking escape, but the streets themselves betrayed him. No matter where he ran, the song followed, echoing in the mist, growing louder, nearer, until it felt as though the stones beneath his feet throbbed in rhythm. And then he saw them. Dozens of figures standing in the fog. Men, women, children, motionless, their faces pale, eyes glassy. Their lips moved in perfect unison, singing the melody he had come to dread. The sound rolled over him, cold and inexorable, a wave he could not resist. At their center, taller than the rest, stood the woman. Not mist. Not reflection. Not horn. Her. The singer. Her gaze locked on him. Her lips curved into that awful smile. And her song rose, louder than ever, until the world itself seemed to bend beneath it. The city no longer belonged to its people. By day, the streets bustled as they always had, vendors shouting, horses clattering, presses pounding. But beneath it all ran the melody, subtle, persistent, woven into every noise. And by night, it grew bolder, swallowing the silence whole. Thomas walked the avenues like a man drowning, every sound dragging him deeper. Laughter became chorus. Whispers became verse. The rhythm of boots on cobblestones became percussion for her endless hymn. Everywhere he turned, someone was humming. A milkman unloading bottles at dawn. A seamstress bent at her window. A boy chalking crude games on the pavement. Each one unaware, their lips shaping the tune as if it had always lived within them. One evening, he forced himself into the pub, seeking noise, distraction, whiskey strong enough to burn the song out of him. The place was crowded, loud with drunken shouts and laughter. For a moment, blessed relief, the melody drowned in human chaos. Then a man at the far table began to hum. Others joined, one by one, without even noticing. The chatter softened. Tankards paused midair. A rhythm formed, steady, insidious. Soon the whole room swayed to the same invisible conductor. Thomas slammed his glass down. "Stop it," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Can't you hear what you're doing?" Dozens of blank eyes turned to him. For a moment, the humming ceased. Then, slowly, deliberately, the song resumed, louder now, directed at him. He fled, their voices chasing him into the fog-drenched streets. At the press room, things grew worse. Jacob no longer pretended to work. He stood beside the machine, lips moving, eyes vacant, humming louder with each passing hour. Soon others joined him, men who had mocked Thomas weeks ago, now caught in the same dreadful cadence. The foreman tried to shout them back to work. They turned their heads in eerie unison, eyes glassy, and began to sing. The presses thundered on, but their song rose above it, filling the room with a resonance that shook the walls. The foreman stumbled back, pale as death. He crossed himself and fled. Thomas, trapped between the machines and their growing choir, felt his knees weaken. The sound pressed into his chest, squeezed his lungs, pounded against his skull. And through it all, he heard her voice threading between theirs, sweet and triumphant. "My choir gathers, Thomas. My hymn begins." Nights became unbearable. He stopped sleeping altogether. Whenever he shut his eyes, visions swarmed him, crowds of pale figures singing in unison, their mouths stretched wide, their voices merging into one vast roar. In the shadows behind them, she waited, her smile sharper, her form clearer. She was no longer content to haunt him in brass or mist. She was stepping fully into the world. And the city welcomed her. One night, unable to endure his apartment, Thomas staggered into the streets. The fog was thicker than ever, muffling the lamps, painting the world in gray. Then he heard it. A choir. Dozens of voices, rising and falling in perfect harmony. He followed, though his body trembled, though his mind screamed to turn back. The sound drew him like a tide. He turned a corner and stopped dead. The square was filled with people. Men, women, children, hundreds of them, standing shoulder to shoulder in the mist. Their faces were pale, their eyes distant, their lips moving in flawless unison. The song rose like a cathedral hymn, echoing against the stone, shaking the very air. And at the center, elevated on the steps of the old courthouse, she stood. The singer. No longer a shadow in brass. No longer a face in fog. She was flesh now, pale, luminous, terrible. Her dark hair spilled over her shoulders, her lips parted in song. And when she lifted her gaze, Thomas felt his heart stop. For the first time, her eyes truly met his. "Come, Thomas," she sang, though her lips barely moved. "Come to me. Lead them." The choir turned in unison. Hundreds of blank eyes fixed on him. Their song swelled, shaking the stones beneath his feet. And Thomas understood, with a terror that hollowed him out. He was not merely her victim. He was meant to be her prophet. The square vibrated with sound. Hundreds of voices fused into a single tide, so vast and consuming it seemed less like music than the very pulse of the earth. Thomas stood at the edge, rooted to the stones, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on her. The singer. Her presence was unbearable. She was beautiful in the way of a knife's edge, sharp, merciless, gleaming. Her pale skin caught the lamplight like porcelain, her lips curved in their eternal almost smile. But it was her eyes that held him. Black voids, endless and absolute, as if all of night had been poured into them. She raised her hand. The choir fell silent. The fog shivered. The square grew so still that Thomas heard his own heartbeat, wild and frantic in his chest. And then she spoke. Thomas Whitfield. The sound did not pass through the air. It rang inside his skull, clear and undeniable. Printer. Dreamer. Listener. Prophet. The crowd stirred. 1,000 eyes fixed on him. Their faces were empty, slack, but their gaze burned into him with weight enough to crush bone. "No," Thomas rasped. His throat was dry, his lips cracked. "Not me. I want nothing to do with this." But his words broke under their stares. The singer descended the courthouse steps, her bare feet silent against the stone. With each step, the fog bent around her, swirling like a veil. She stopped a breath away from him. Up close, her presence was suffocating. He smelled rain, ash, something metallic beneath it all. Her gaze pierced straight through his trembling frame, down into the marrow. "You woke me," she whispered. "You gave me voice. You carried me into the world. You are mine." Thomas shook his head violently, tears stinging his eyes. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." Her hand rose. Not to strike. Not to comfort. But to touch his cheek, the way a mother might soothe a fevered child. Her skin was cold as ice, yet it burned where it met his flesh. "Through you, they hear me. Through you, they will follow." She turned, lifting her gaze toward the crowd. "Behold your prophet." The choir erupted. A sound like thunder, like an ocean breaking. Hundreds of voices chanting his name, over and over, until it was no longer his own but a hymn. "Thomas. Thomas. Thomas." He staggered back, shaking his head, covering his ears. The sound pressed into his bones, rattling his teeth, crushing his heart. "Stop," he screamed. "Stop." But they did not. The singer leaned close, her lips brushing his ear. "You cannot stop what has begun. You can only lead it." Her breath slid cold down his neck. The chant swelled, louder, deafening. Faces blurred into a sea of pale mouths, all opening in unison. And in that moment, Thomas felt something inside him snap. Not fear. Not horror. Something worse. Recognition. A sliver of himself, deep, buried, secret, thrilled to their voices. Some hidden hunger answered her song. And for the first time, Thomas understood the truth she had known all along. Part of him wanted this. The chanting pursued him long after he fled the square. He stumbled through fog-thick alleys, clutching at walls slick with mist, his ears ringing with their voices. "Thomas. Thomas. Thomas." He reached his apartment in a haze, slammed the door, shoved the bolt home. But silence never came. The chant had followed him inside, reverberating in the walls, the floor, the very air. And there she was. The phonograph spun though no hand had touched it. The record hissed. Her voice poured out, low and coaxing, the way one might soothe a skittish animal. "You cannot run from your name." Thomas collapsed against the wall, sobs racking his chest. "Why me? Why not someone else?" "Because you listened," she breathed. "You heard me when no one else would. You opened the door. I didn't know. I thought it was just a song." Her laughter slid through him like silk over skin. "And was it not beautiful? Even now, you crave it." He wanted to scream denial. He wanted to spit at her, to defy her. But his throat closed around the words. Because part of her was right. Even through his terror, even as his sanity frayed, some hidden part of him yearned for that voice. Sleep abandoned him entirely. When his body collapsed, wrung out from exhaustion, dreams seized him. He dreamt of endless choirs gathered in vast, crumbling cathedrals. Pale figures swayed in rows, mouths open, voices pouring upward until the stone itself shook. And at the altar stood the singer, her arms raised, her gaze upon him. "Lead them," she whispered. "It is why you were born." He woke screaming, drenched in sweat, the song still vibrating in his chest. The infection of her hymn grew bolder in the city. At the press room, Jacob no longer worked at all. He stood on a crate, chanting verses of her melody as if preaching. And the others listened. Men who had scoffed, men hardened by years of labor, now swayed like children at a lullaby. Thomas tried to shout sense into them. "Stop. Don't listen. Can't you see what she's doing?" But they turned toward him as one, smiling with slack, empty faces. "Prophet," Jacob whispered, his voice reverent. "Sing with us." Thomas fled, bile rising in his throat. Days blurred. Nights shattered. And then, the first act. He did not remember how it began. Only that one evening, he found himself on Mulberry Street, surrounded by mist. A crowd had gathered, silent, expectant, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on him. In his hand he clutched the phonograph record. He had not carried it there. He did not even recall leaving his room. Yet here it was, its surface gleaming black in the lamplight. The crowd parted. And she stood before him. The singer. Pale, radiant, terrible. Her gaze pinned him in place. Her lips parted. "Play it." Thomas shook his head weakly. His arms trembled. "No. I can't." Her voice slid into his veins like ice water. "Play it." And before he could resist, his hands moved. The crowd offered up a phonograph, he did not know from where, nor who had carried it, but it was there, waiting, like everything else in her design. His fingers set the record on the turntable. His hand cranked the key. The needle lowered. The song burst forth. The crowd swayed. Their lips moved in unison. The hymn rose into the fog, shaking the stones, echoing across the dark. Thomas stood among them, trembling, tears streaking his face. He tried to stop, tried to step back, but his feet rooted to the ground. His throat ached, and then, against his will, he opened his mouth. And he sang. Her song poured from his lips, clear and perfect, as though it had always been there. The crowd roared in answer. The singer smiled. And Thomas understood, with horror that hollowed him out, that he had crossed the line. He was no longer only her victim. He was becoming her voice. New York was gone. The city still stood, the towers, the bridges, the endless sprawl of streets, but it no longer lived. It had become an echo chamber, a hollow instrument carved for one purpose, to sing her hymn. Thomas stumbled through it like a ghost, every step accompanied by the ceaseless refrain. Vendors no longer shouted prices. They chanted. Children no longer laughed. They sang. Even the dogs in the alleys howled in rhythm, their cries bending to her melody. Every corner, every window, every brick seemed alive with sound. The press room was silent now, the machines stilled. Not broken, abandoned. The workers no longer needed them. They sat in rows upon the factory floor, lips moving in harmony, their eyes vacant, their bodies swaying gently as though rocked by invisible waves. The foreman hung himself from the rafters. Thomas found him there one night, swaying with the rhythm, his boots knocking against the wood in perfect time. The churches rang with her hymn. Thomas crept into St. Mark's, desperate, seeking some refuge, some shred of the old world. Candles still burned. Stained glass still glowed with fractured light. But the pews were filled with worshippers whose prayers had been replaced by her song. Even the priest knelt before the altar, arms raised, lips moving in unison with the rest. Above them, the great organ groaned to life. Not played by hands, the pipes themselves howled, belching smoke, yet producing notes that bent to her will. The church trembled with the force of it, as though the very stones longed to sing. Thomas fled, clutching his ears, tears streaming down his face. Night fell, and the streets became worse. Fog rolled thick, and through it moved processions, groups of men and women marching in perfect unison, their bare feet slapping stone in rhythm. They carried phonographs on their shoulders like relics, each horn spilling her melody into the night. They passed him without seeing, eyes blank, mouths open. Their voices joined the phonographs until the air itself seemed to rupture with sound. On the rooftops, figures stood silhouetted against the gaslight haze, singing into the night sky as though offering the hymn to the stars. And when Thomas lifted his gaze, he thought, for one terrible instant, that the stars themselves pulsed in rhythm with the song. His apartment offered no refuge. The phonograph played without pause now, spinning even without the record, its horn pouring endless melody. The walls shook. The floorboards quivered. He smashed the machine with a hammer, splintering the wood, bending the brass. For a blessed moment, silence. Then the shards vibrated. The bent horn hissed. The broken pieces dragged themselves together, as if pulled by unseen strings. And the phonograph stood whole once more. "You cannot destroy me," her voice sang. "I am in every voice now. In every breath. In every stone." The city was hers. Thomas wandered the avenues, gaunt and hollow, watching the world dissolve into choir. At the river, dockworkers swayed as one, their chants rising with the tide. On the bridges, crowds gathered, their voices carrying into the dark water. In the parks, children sang as they played, their games woven into verses of her hymn. And everywhere, always, he felt her eyes. She appeared in windows, in reflections, in the shifting folds of fog. Sometimes across the street, sometimes a breath away. Always watching. Always smiling. "Sing for them, prophet," she whispered. "Lead them. Lead my world." And Thomas, broken, hollow, whispered back through cracked lips, "I can't." But when the hymn swelled again, he found his voice rising to join it. Thomas no longer recognized himself in mirrors. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken, hair wild. His lips trembled even in silence, as if his body longed to shape the hymn on its own. He had become a hollow vessel. But somewhere, deep in the ruins of his mind, a spark of resistance still burned. He clung to it with all the strength left in him. One night, when the city's choir rose loud enough to shake the heavens, he fled again into the streets. Not blindly this time, but with purpose. He carried a lantern in one hand, an iron hammer in the other. His breath steamed in the chill fog. There was one thing he had not yet tried. The record. He had smashed the phonograph, and failed. But what if the song itself, the black disc that had first carried her voice into the world, could be destroyed? Perhaps she had spread too far. Perhaps the record was meaningless now. But it was all he had left. The tenement groaned as he burst into his apartment. The phonograph sat in the corner, playing though its needle scraped bare wood. Her voice poured forth, strong and sweet, taunting. "Thomas," she crooned, "why fight what you already are?" He ignored her. He tore the record from its sleeve, the black disc gleaming faintly in the lamplight. His hands shook, sweat dripping onto its grooves. The voice faltered. "No," she hissed, sharp now, urgent. "Not that." Thomas lifted the hammer. His breath came ragged. He screamed and brought it down. The hammer struck and bounced. The record did not crack. Did not even scratch. Instead, it sang. A single pure note rang out, sharp enough to split his ears, vibrating through the hammer, into his arms, rattling his bones. He fell back with a cry, clutching his skull. The record spun in the air, unharmed, then settled gently onto the phonograph. And her laughter filled the room. You cannot destroy me. I am written in more than grooves. I am written in you. Madness clawed at him. He smashed furniture, hurled books, tore his walls with bleeding hands. But the song always returned. The record glowed faintly now, as though alive, pulsing with each note. Finally, he collapsed in the corner, weeping. But then, a thought. If he could not destroy it, perhaps he could bury it. Lock it away where no one could hear. Cast it into the deepest place he could find. It was a fool's hope. But fools were all that remained. At dawn, Thomas staggered through the city streets, the record wrapped in cloth, pressed tight against his chest. The choir was everywhere. Processions moved through the fog, phonographs blaring from every corner, voices raised in unison. Yet none seemed to notice him. He walked among them unseen, unheard, as if carrying the record cloaked him. He reached the river. The black water lapped against the stones, thick with mist. Bridges loomed overhead, their arches echoing with song. Thomas waded into the current, clutching the record high. This ends with me, he rasped. His voice shook, but resolve burned in it still. He lifted the record, ready to hurl it into the depths. And then she was there. The fog parted. She stood on the riverbank, pale and terrible, her hair streaming like black banners in the wind. Her eyes pierced him. "Throw it, Thomas," she whispered. "See what happens." Her smile widened. "It will not drown. But you will." The water rose around his chest, tugging him down, pulling at his legs with icy hands. He screamed, lifted the record higher, but his arms trembled, his strength failing. Her voice filled the night. Not soft now, not coaxing. Commanding. "Sing." And his mouth opened. Against his will, against his desperate struggle, the hymn poured out of him, carried across the black water. The city answered. Thousands of voices rose as one. And Thomas knew, his last resistance had failed. The river carried his voice. Thomas clutched the record to his chest, his body half submerged, water dragging at him with relentless weight. Yet even as the current pulled, the song rose from his throat, steady, perfect, unstoppable. It was no longer his voice. It was hers. The hymn poured across the dark water, echoed against stone bridges, and rebounded into the city like thunder. Windows rattled. Lamps flickered. The very air quivered. And the city answered. From every street, every alley, every rooftop, voices rose in unison. A chorus of thousands, bound by one melody, one will. The hymn no longer belonged to the phonograph. It belonged to the world. Thomas staggered from the river, soaked and trembling, his mind a ruin. Yet his body moved with dreadful purpose, guided not by his will but by hers. He walked the fog-drenched streets, the record clutched like a relic. Crowds gathered at his passing. Men, women, children. Their eyes shone with fevered light, their lips moving to the same endless refrain. They reached toward him as if toward a savior. "Prophet," they whispered. "Lead us." He tried to shake his head, to scream, to tell them he was no leader, only a slave. But his mouth betrayed him. "My children," he heard himself say, though the voice was not his. "Sing." And they obeyed. The city shook with the force of it. Buildings groaned, glass shattered, street lamps burst. The bridges trembled as if straining beneath the weight of the hymn. The air itself seemed to fracture, every note opening cracks in the fabric of silence until there was nothing left but sound. Above, the fog swirled into vast spirals, pulsing in rhythm. Lightning forked silently within, white veins across a bruised sky. And in the heart of it all, she stood. The singer. Not mist, not brass, not apparition. Flesh made perfect by song. Her eyes burned with endless night, her smile sharp and triumphant. She raised her arms, and the choir, the city itself, roared in exultation. At last, she sang, her voice flooding every throat, every heart. At last, the hymn is unbroken. Thomas fell to his knees. The record slipped from his hand, yet it did not fall, it floated, spinning slowly in the air before her, glowing faintly like an eclipsed sun. She reached for it, her fingers closing around the disc. At her touch, the grooves shimmered, and for a heartbeat Thomas glimpsed faces within, countless, screaming, trapped in endless song. And then they vanished. "You gave me voice," she whispered, gazing down at him. "And for that, you will never be silent again." Her hand touched his forehead. And Thomas sang. Not with his throat, not with his breath, but with his soul. A torrent of sound burst from within him, endless, unstoppable, pouring into the night sky until he no longer knew where he ended and the hymn began. The city dissolved into choir. Tenements, markets, churches, docks, all vanished in the swell of sound. There was no city. No river. No sky. Only the hymn, infinite, eternal, stretching into every corner of the earth. And beyond. Far across oceans, ships' crews lifted their heads and hummed. In distant towns, farmers paused their plows and began to sing. Children in their sleep murmured verses they had never learned. Bells tolled in rhythm without hands to strike them. The hymn spread, and spread, and spread. And Thomas, or what remained of him, sang at its center. His body was gone. His face forgotten. He was voice alone, woven into her song, carried forever on its current. There was no resistance left. No silence. Only her hymn. And it would never end. Years later, they spoke of it in whispers. Travelers told of New York as it had been, a place that once bustled with life, with presses and markets and noise. But they also spoke of what it became. The city that sang. They said that one night, the streets fell silent. The fog rolled thicker than ever, swallowing lamps, bridges, towers. And then, a sound rose. Not bells. Not whistles. Not laughter. A hymn. An endless, terrible hymn. Some swore they could still hear it when the wind blew east, faint and low, like a choir carried across oceans. Others said ships that drew too close to its harbor returned empty, their decks littered with abandoned clothes, their crew vanished without a trace. A few claimed survivors staggered into nearby towns, lips cracked, throats raw, singing verses that never ended until they collapsed in silence. But the city itself? No one returned from it. From a distance, on certain nights, they said you could still see the glow through the fog. And if you listened closely, you would hear it. The hymn. Unbroken. Endless. And at its heart, a single name whispered still, not as a man, not as a memory, but as a word in the song. Thomas.